the difference between the Sunni and the Shiites is over that foundational question of religious leadership. The Shiites believe that God grants certain members of the family of the Prophet Muhammad the right to lead the community, and the Sunnis believe that it has to be humans who decide that because God didn't say anything on that matter. And from that foundational differentiation, you have a divergence, yes? So from there, you have different institutions in the Sunni and the Shiite worlds. You have different schools of law. In the Sunni and Shiite world, you have different rituals, and so on and so forth. Sufism is this modality within Islam in which the believer tries to tap into this knowledge of God, of being in God in a direct way, right? So they develop a series of exercises and techniques, study groups, modes of learning, all sorts of ritual practices, etc., in order to try to achieve this union with the divine. So they say, I want to be in God. Because the question of Sufism is a question of how do you access, how do you tap to this direct source of the divine, of this connection with God, and so on, this doesn't have to do with the Sunni-Shia divide. So in practical terms, what that means is that we have in the modern world Sufi organizations that are Shiite, like the Nimatulahi, for example, or Sufi organizations that are Sunni, like the Qadiriyya, for example, or whatever, many others, right? The criticism of the Salafis against the Sufis is the following. With the emergence of Islam, in the early days of Islam, Islam appears as a religion, monotheistic religion, that does not accept a mediation between the believer and God. The relationship between the person and God is direct. That means that there is no ultimate religious authority. We don't have people that are trained in a particular way so that they know more than the rest about God and they tell you what to do on certain regards in godly matters, right? Over time, Islam progresses and advances historically, and then what happens is that there are de facto bodies and institutions that de facto claim religious authority over the population. So when we want to do something in matters of law, for example, you have these individuals that are there, and you go and ask them what should we do in those regards, and they tell you what to do. In modern times, Salafism appears as a critique to the existence of these de facto religious authorities. And they say we should go back to the origin, to this direct encounter. One of the groups that have created very solidified de facto religious authorities are the Sufis, because they follow these religious leaders that have a lot of charisma. And so what the Salafis say is, you say you are monotheist and that you only adore God, but we see you adoring or having a lot of respect for people who are not God, who are humans, right? And so here is where the debate comes, whether what the Sufis do is adoration of someone that it's not God, or whether they just do is to try to find in these people an example to directly meet God without intermediaries. So it's that question of the intermediaries that divide them, basically. In the US, there was backing of Sufi groups against this emerging trend, or like more consolidating or growing trend of Salafism. There were, in the UK, there was official backing of the government of certain Sufi groups, in Russia, in Central Asia, in other parts of the world. Between the 9th and the 12th century, they created these structures that are characteristic in the Muslim world, religious organizations known as the Sufi orders. So these Sufi orders are groups of people that follow a religious leader, and this religious leader trains them in these techniques in order to have this direct access to the divine, right? So normally these Sufi orders are quite small. The number of people, of initiates that decide to be part of these Sufi groups, normally it's quite small. But the Sufi orders have a very wide impact socially in the Muslim world. And so what that means is that in many occasions they can be quite important as social mobilizers of people. Yeah? So they exert a role in social mobilization, and sometimes they have a political role as well, right? For example, in the elections this year in Pakistan, yeah, we have Sufi congregations that gather huge amount of people, thousands of people, and it's very difficult to say when these are religious gatherings or political rallies, right? So you have particular religious organizations that support particular candidates, and the fact that the organization supports the candidates really gives a lot of help to the candidate to advance their political objectives, right? Sufism, because it's so widespread across the world and it has so many religious organizations that happen to be Sufi, is very diverse in its political outlook, if you want, right? And so if we have to speak merely in political terms, we can say that there are organizations that happen to be Sufi that will be much more on the liberal spectrum, if you want, of the political palette. And there are organizations that are socially much more conservative. Of course, there is everything, and it is quite diverse, but generally speaking, they tend to be socially conservative. So, for example, you will have many Sufi groups in favor of a gendered order of society, division of genders, many Sufi groups in favor of particular approaches to Sharia law that are contravene human rights in a number of cases. You have in East Africa, for example, a very strong presence of Sufism. In North Africa, a very strong presence, but places like the Gulf, the countries in the Gulf, have a much weaker Sufi presence, right? So, for example, in the current conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, we see that the Sufis don't play a very prominent role. And the reason why they don't play a very prominent role is because Sufism in that society, in the current moment, it's not a prominent social role, like doesn't have a very prominent social role. It played in the past, until colonial times it was pretty much important in the region, but today it's not so prominent. So it makes sense that we don't see Sufi leaders appearing, making public stances or things like that as they would do in South Asia or in Sri Lanka or, I don't know, in other places. The answer, I think, it's pretty straightforward, no. And we have a number of examples of that. Afghanistan, for example, is a society ridden by all forms of political conflict and is a society with a wide Sufi presence. You have Pakistan, a society with a wide Sufi presence and quite significant load of political conflicts, also political conflicts with a certain load of religious content as well. So where you have a wide presence of Sufism, if in these societies there is a political conflict, you can be certain that the Sufis will play a role on that. Syria, for example, right? If you have a society in which Sufism is not so present and there is a political conflict, of course, Sufism doesn't play a role, but that's not because of the apolitical nature of the Sufi, but just because they are not represented in that society, right? So.